Yes.
Okay, so we're going to start with the African American civil rights movements. So it's important to note that the problems of the African American civil rights movements were rooted in the Constitution. The original Constitution made slavery legal and made African Americans property. However, the roots of reform were also embedded in the Constitution. Marbury versus Madison was a case that gave the Supreme Court the power to overturn laws that were inconsistent with the Constitution. It would take a long time, but this would eventually be a big deal. Again, the original Constitution designated African Americans as property. What changed was the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, the 14th Amendment, well, let me go to the 15th Amendment, 15th Amendment allowing for the vote for African Americans, and the 14th Amendment allowing for equal protection under the laws. And that phrase, equal protection under the laws in the 14th Amendment, has had more impact on all civil rights movements than any other language in the Constitution. So even after these amendments were passed, however, the courts continued to resist full rights for African Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson was 1896 was a case that basically said that separate facilities and accommodations for African Americans were constitutional as long as they were equal. Now, in fact, they were very unequal, but this law basically allowed segregation, the so-called Jim Crow laws, to continue for many years. There are many court cases in between, but the other end point of this discussion on equal protection under the laws was Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. You all are familiar with the details, basically saying that separate accommodations in any aspect of American life is inherently unequal. And essentially that was the legal end of segregation. But in fact, segregation continued long after Brown, and that was the genesis for the civil rights movements, especially Martin Luther King's movement. King basically, 254, Ms. Taylor.
No, I just wanted to get my folder. Is that okay?
Yeah. So King's movement basically was a non-violent resistance movement, and King had three goals. First, an end to police brutality against civil rights protesters. Second, economic equality between the races. There was dramatically more poverty in the African American community than the white community. And third, full voting rights, eliminating the obstacles that prevented African Americans from voting, things like poll taxes and literacy tests. So King made one of his greatest confrontations. There were several, but one was in Birmingham, Alabama, and his foil there was a brutally repressive Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor. And Connor and his police cracked down ruthlessly on African American protesters, to include King. And in the letter from Birmingham jail was King's seminal statement on nonviolent resistance. And his basic argument was, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to peace everywhere. Without justice, there cannot be peace. However, first, King's seminal accomplishments were the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which basically guaranteed equality of accommodations to all Americans. So no more segregated lunch counters, no more segregated bathrooms, restaurants. All that was now against the law in every state. And the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which basically guaranteed voting rights and provided federal supervision to prevent states from blocking voting rights. Now, King's opponents were, of course, those who were just racially biased, but there was also a federalism argument in play, that basically the states had the authority under the Constitution to govern their own laws regarding voting, and that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were violations of the Federalist principles of the Constitution. Courts rejected these arguments, and King ultimately prevailed. However, by the end of his life, he was being marginalized because many felt that they were not making enough progress fast enough, and so others began to assert a more confrontational stance. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam basically advocated a self-defense stance. Not a violent resistance movement, but that basically African Americans, like all human beings, had the right to defend themselves, to include using violence to defend themselves. And they argued for separation from American society. Still more extreme were people like Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers basically arguing that violent resistance and Marxist revolution were the only remedies to American society. So ultimately King's view prevailed, but by the end of his life, King was being marginalized, and the year he was killed was one of the most disruptive years in American history. Remember, 1968, in February, the Tet Offensive showing that the Vietnam War was failing. March, Lyndon Johnson withdraws to the presidency. April, King is assassinated. June, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. So basically, the ends, by 1968, the ends are getting more extreme. There's no real middle, moderate middle. Basically, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King constituted the middle, and now the extremes are taking over. On the right, people like George Wallace and Richard Nixon. On the left, extremes like the Black Panthers. So the moderate middle is being hollowed out, and the ends are getting more extreme. So that takes us to the youth movement. The youth movement was important because it happened at the same time as the civil rights movement. The most important part of the youth movement are the numbers. So by 1960, about half of all Americans were under the age of 21. The baby boom generation, basically those born between 1946 and 1964, about 80 million Americans constituted this incredible demographic bulge, this huge cohort of young people, and they were demanding change. So the civil rights movement was part of that change. The Vietnam War was another part of that. This generation, in large part, was protesting the Vietnam War and was opposed to it, and saw themselves as different and separate from American culture. One expression of that was the Woodstock concert event, which occurred in 1969. Woodstock was meant to be a peaceful gathering to celebrate music, peace, freedom. The organizers expected about 50,000, instead about 500,000 people showed up at Woodstock. So the key with to Woodstock was this was the first time that this generation felt its power, because they saw 500,000 of them all together in one spot, and they realized they were a force for change, and that helped them organize and push for change in the Vietnam War. Another aspect of change was the 1968 Democratic Convention. Here the youth movement was again pushing for a strong stance against the Vietnam War. Their candidate was Eugene McCarthy, and basically the argument was that Eugene McCarthy would be the candidate